Tell us everything you know about Paul McCartney, John Lennon, and the Beatles in 60 seconds.
Oh, geez. Okay, so they were a major part of the British invasion. They were fashion and hair icons. Ringo was Mr. Conductor on Thomas the Tank Engine, which is my favorite thing about him and why he's my favorite Beatle. But their music rocks. I would have been so sad without them. They were so influential. But, oh yeah, drugs. I did watch a documentary last night to see like their dynamic together, but that's pretty much everything I know about the Beatles.
Welcome. This is the first episode of the What If Pop podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Koji.
And I'm the other host, Katie. This is where we dive headfirst into the intriguing and imaginative world of pop culture's most fascinating what if scenarios. In this episode, we're asking the question, what if Paul McCartney was murdered instead of John Lennon? Ugh, heart-wrenching.
Sometimes we'll have guests, and sometimes it'll be us. This week, it'll just be the two of us. So, Katie, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a filmmaker and an artist. I work on whatever inspires me at the time, but at the moment, mostly costume design, dancing, writing, sculpture, and I'm a Twitch streamer. You can just catch whatever I'm doing on Instagram.
What's a costume designer? I mean, what does that mean?
You know, ever since I was really young, I would just want to look like my favorite people that were on television. And so I would just gather whatever was in my closet. And more recently, I found myself in a position to do like some pretty professional, like cosplay type stuff. Recently, I did like prosthetics and a full Mystique for Halloween. That was super awesome, but I'm always just finding some sort of reason to dress up as somebody that I am not. Why don't you tell us about yourself, Koji?
I'm a writer, producer. I am a podcast maker. I have another podcast called The Unofficial Official Story, where I'm the host and editor and producer. I also am a dad and a baseball coach, and I'm a professor too. So I teach at a couple of universities, and I'm doing a lot of writing and writing-related stuff. That did not sound exciting, but all of that stuff is pretty exciting.
I don't know. I took your class and it was awesome. I got a whole script out of it.
That's awesome. Should we get started?
Yeah, let's dive headfirst into this wormhole.
So before we answer the question, it would be good for us to get some background. So unless you've lived under a rock since pre-1960, you should know who the Beatles are. But just in case, here are some quick facts about them, and I mean quick. The Beatles consisted of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. John and Paul served as the primary songwriters for the band. Their first album, Please Please Me, was released in 1963, and their last album, Let It Be, was released in 1970. By the way, I didn't even know Let It Be was the last album. According to Wikipedia, they are the best-selling musical act of all time with an estimated 600 million units sold. That's a lot, by the way, just to let you know.
Yeah.
John Lennon was shot on December 8th, 1980 in New York City by a gentleman named Mark David Chapman. According to a New York Post article, Chapman killed Lennon for fame. That's why people kill everybody, I guess. He said he wanted to be somebody and nothing was going to stop that. He has been denied parole 12 times since his conviction. Paul McCartney has continued to put out many best-selling albums and songs since John's death, but there's been a shadow over Paul's career since John died. In one quote, Paul said, "The minute John died, there started to be a revisionism. There were some strange quotes like John was the only one of the Beatles, or Paul booked the studio." That's sad. I think Paul's a little bitter.
First of all, I will not tolerate any unkind words about any of the members of the band, especially Ringo.
Ringo's not even a part of this conversation.
What? No, I don't care. George was the unsung hero of the whole group.
Yarn.
I guess, whatever. But like,
no Paul, no John, and there's no Beatles.
Without any one of them, there's no Beatles. But
I could have been Ringo Starr, to be honest with you.
Excuse me. I was watching a documentary last night to see their dynamic, and I just feel very strongly that, like, without any one of them, it wouldn't have been the Beatles. You know, you replace one person, sure, they may have still made some great songs, but each one of them was intricate to what the legends that they became and their influence on music and all of us.
The thing about fame, I teach this in class and I talk about this a lot, but fame is so fickle and success is fickle too, and it has nothing to do with the people that are in it.
Oh.
This is a story I've shared multiple times on different podcasts, but I'll share it here because this is our first episode. One of my friends is a best-selling novelist, and he always talks about how the success of your project has almost nothing to do with you. And the reason being is that you could write the greatest book, the greatest novel, say, in the history of writing, but it comes out on September 11th, 2001. And no one's going to read or care about your book anymore.
That's a good point.
Conversely, you could write a book about vampires that walk around in the daylight and sparkle, and werewolves that are hunky, and all of a sudden you're like, the greatest writer in the history of writing. That just goes to show that you have no control over the success of a project. I mean, if it was about talent, there's a lot of talented people that will never make anything. Or if there's a lack of talent, there's a lot of untalented people that are very successful. And so there's other factors, it's hitting the zeitgeist at the right time. It's the right moment at the right time kind of thing, right?
I totally agree. There are so many Beethovens out there. There are so many, just name anyone who's successful, and they just don't get their moment to shine.
But that has nothing to do with them. So I think that in this case, John, Paul, and all those guys were there at the right moment. And if there wasn't another one of them, I don't know if that means that they're going to be more or less successful. But I think that they hit something at the right moment. I have a feeling they would be successful regardless of it.
It was the hair.
It was the hair. I mean, they were propped up by a lot of people, I think.
Yeah. I actually learned something really crazy last night when I was watching this documentary, and I can't remember his first name, but the guy that first discovered them, the guy that first produced them, he actually died at 32. So he actually wasn't around for a whole lot of their career, but he did get them started.
Well, and didn't they play a lot in a bar in Ireland or something?
The Cavern.
Yeah, they did their 10,000 hours or something. Yeah, that's fine.
Everyone would recognize it if they saw it in a picture.
There's no way for us to fact check any of this information. I mean, if there was
it's a multiverse anyways.
Yeah, there could have been a
Mandela effect even.
Mandela effect, yes. But yeah, I mean, they spent a long time working on their craft. But I know a lot of musicians that are super talented that never made it either. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of factors. So now that we have the background, let's share our what if scenarios. Do you want to go first?
Okay, so it's just so big. I feel a little intimidated by the task. So what if Paul McCartney had been murdered instead of John Lennon? So I feel like whatever the Beatles were at that point may have gone in a little bit different direction. I feel like...
Well, they weren't anything at that point.
I just see Paul as being the kind of more dapper fellow, the kind of more straight, narrow path, and John Lennon was a little bit more exploratory. So we got a lot of beautiful songs from Paul McCartney, and he's a very, very talented musician, but I feel like we would have seen more exploratory stuff. With them, maybe we wouldn't say that either of them are the leaders of the band, but they're certainly the face of the band.
I would say John's the leader of the band, but okay.
Okay.
we disagree apparently on this.
Okay. So, but we would have seen a lot more exploratory type stuff. I feel like from Paul, we get a lot of, typical music that we're used to. It's very beautiful, but John, we may have seen music in general. Let me put it that way. The Beatles are done. Music in general, rock and roll go in a more exploratory way, or maybe he would have been a leader in more of the exploratory stuff, like how the Doors, they are very exploratory in music. We would have seen more of that.
Okay.
What do you think?
I think Paul would get more credit for the songs he's done on the Beatles if he died earlier. We as a society have a tendency to lionize people that have died.
That's true.
So he would have been a lot bigger. Even though I love John, I think that if John had lived, I have a feeling he would have worn out his welcome in terms of being a weirdo.
Ended up being more controversial.
Yeah, and it's like those guys who are hippies, and then at some point they get out of step, and all of a sudden they're a little bit behind, what's happening, and not in terms of popular culture, but in terms of it's like those guys, we all know them, who are super down and they're hippies, but they hate gay people.
Cool, but I'm thinking very cancelable, potentially cancelable.
That's what I think. Because he's always pushing the envelope. At some point he could push it too far.
I feel like they can do no wrong.
Yeah, and then they kind of go in the wrong direction. So I feel like John wouldn't be seen as such a deity of music had he continued to live. Him dying kind of allowed him to, he did Imagine, and he did all these great songs, and then he died. And then there's no more songs or no more John. And we remember him at that age, at that time. Free spirit, against the war, all those things at that time. And Paul, because he kept living and he kept going and he had, hit albums in the 80s and 90s and today, we kind of just keep seeing him. We don't respect him. It's kind of like when my mom lived all my life, but my dad died early. And so everything my dad has, or everything I have of my dad is super important. But my mom lived a lot longer. And so her stuff is not nearly as important to me because I had her for much longer.
Yeah.
So it's in the same way I think that would have happened to Paul. But I think Paul's legacy would be way, 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 way more exciting and bigger had he lived.
Dare we even touch on some of the popular controversial ideas, such as that maybe Paul did die? A lot of people think Paul died back in the day and he's been replaced by a clone robot model person.
The theory is that he's replaced by a person.
Yes.
And then that person was pretending to be Paul, but not like a robot or something. That'd be crazy. Or a clone. That'd be crazy.
Sorry, I went a little off the edge there. Well, welcome to my world.
But, it could happen. I mean, I don't.
Then who's making the music now? I mean, I don't know. Then they're that's like a singing in the rain situation. I don't know. What else? How else would our world change? And I think of it more as like a musician myself, a drummer myself. How would things have changed if John Lennon had lived and it was Paul that got murdered?
I mean, I think John would have divorced Yoko. That's for sure.
Yeah, it was really interesting watching the documentary because so many people like to talk about her influence. I try to be an unjudgmental person and say, well, I wasn't there, I don't know. But it is very interesting how she was just there, watching them try and write these songs. I don't know how much she influenced the songs, but what was interesting is how it's the four of them and then her just sitting there. How that might have influenced John's thinking. But what if it's something think about the butterfly effect. What if they had had coffee someplace different that day? And
wait, weren't they coming out of their own building, or are they coming to their building?
I'm just trying to think of some random thing. Okay, they decided to have tea instead of coffee that morning, or toast instead of eggs. They'd come out of the building at a different. I guess the shooter would have been there anyways. He was just waiting.
Yeah, because he was obsessed with him, right? He was following him around and stuff. I mean, if he was going to shoot one of them, though, I think you shoot John, not Paul.
Yeah, because it was all about him saying, we're bigger than God, right? Or I'm bigger than Jesus. And that was part of it. He's like, well, okay, I want fame. This is going to bring me fame. My one road to fame is to be killing someone who's big as God.
If he killed Ringo Starr instead, do you think that the Beatles would have gotten back together?
Well, first of all, we wouldn't have Mr. Conductor on Thomas the Tank Engine, and that would have definitely changed our lives forever.
No, Thomas the Tank Engine's creepy, so we're okay with that. It's like a dystopian world of
It is
people,
very interesting.
People being forced to work and being happy being workers. It's terrible. It's a terrible show.
I haven't seen it as an adult, so maybe I should. That's an interesting take. I haven't seen it as an adult.
Yeah, it's I think it's a metaphor for communism and the worker, because there's all these trains that just got to work and work and work and work until they can't work anymore.
Okay, that's my homework. I'm going to go watch Thomas the Tank Engine again. Ringo Starr, though, I mean, okay, so as a drummer, this is what I would say. He has an interesting style on how he plays the hi-hat, which I think is really interesting. For me, I love complicated stuff. I love learning Tool and, progressive rock, modern progressive rock, anything complicated. Now, going back to something that is, I want to say pure or basic, as what the Beatles were doing, when you're just thinking of that era of rock and roll and the style at the time. He did have an interesting technique that was, I had to backtrack and try and learn.
They would have been fine. Come on. They would have just got another drummer.
I'm gonna let poor Ringo. He's
I'm sure he's a nice gentleman. I'm not disparaging his niceness. I'm disparaging the fact that of all four of those guys, I think
do this.
He's the least talented of those four. It's okay.
I'm taking us off topic because it is the What If Pop podcast. What if a different drummer from a different popular band? What is one of your favorite bands? Let's take that drummer and put them in the Beatles.
I like rap music, so there's no drums. Sorry.
Questlove.
Questlove's not as good of a drummer as these guys.
I actually feel he would fit in very, very well.
The Beatles?
Yeah, with his style. I mean, he's a master of his craft. He could do anything.
Yeah, he did say something anti-Japanese once, so then I wasn't super excited.
I'm sorry.
No,
I didn't know that.
No, he went to Japan. I forget what he said, but he said something negative, and I was just like, from that point on, I wasn't a huge fan of the Roots or him.
I recant everything I said.
No,
We're finding a different drummer.
No, that's fine.
Oh, man. Okay, then what about... But this is a big deal. What if we replace George Harrison, who is an incredible guitar player? What if we replace him with... I'm going to let you do it. I'm a musician and I'm overthinking this. I want you to pick like your favorite guitar player and then put him in place of George Harrison. Or we should find a bass player and replace Paul.
I'm not a music guy.
That's why I'm asking you. I want you to pick your favorite band and we're going to replace that musician.
Honestly, my favorite band is Tupac Shakur. So.
Okay. This, you know what?
I'm the worst person to talk to about this.
That's fair. All right. Well, I do think it was an interesting thing to think about, and maybe people listening at home would like to play that game and replace different members of the Beatles with their favorite band's members, but it has to be like almost a whole different thing.
It'll change. I mean, but the Beatles were changing anyway.
Okay. Have you seen any of the Beatles movies?
Yeah, at some point, but I haven't seen it in the last like 20, 30 years. So
man. I just don't know what to say. They're so bizarre.
Well, they were weird.
Like serve a purpose.
They were weird in general.
I know.
John was the weirdest, I think. I mean, in terms of like between John and Paul, he was the loose cannon.
I feel like I was talking to my friend about this, like how there was a time in my life like where all I listened to was the Beatles, and their harmonizations as well, I think, are so important. But like how freeing it was, like being a teenager who listened to like their early stuff, which was like so basic, so nice, so okay for like anyone to listen to, and then like watching them like transition to their like later phases where they're like, we're gonna add drugs to all this, and like how freeing that is. It's like we can all like grow into somebody different.
All right, so which story do we think is the most plausible? Which story do we wish actually happened? What do you think?
Do I have to pick which person I want to get murdered?
Which of the, I mean, what do you think is the most plausible version of what would happen if...
I agree with you in that I think John was just kind of full of himself, and he did say he was like God, and he felt like he could do no wrong, and he would have eventually just gone so far off the deep end that he became a very controversial person who said something very controversial, and we're like, you know what, John? Forget you.
Yeah. Well, who's an example of that?
That's a good point.
There's versions of that though.
They're like cool, and then
they're just out of touch.
So many.
There's a lot. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of the best one. J.K. Rowling.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, I guess she had the same. I mean, she was the most famous writer in our time for a long time. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
And then the transgender issue is something that's more. That's a harder issue for people my age. Yeah, so that's a good one.
Yeah. I mean, and I think about like kind of parallel as far as arts go. I've been watching, a lot of people talk about the stories and how deep they are as far as like understanding how to interact with other humans and like understanding life and like becoming the best person. And then she did what she did, and you're like, how did all these great things come out of the same person who's also being so hateful in a way, Well,
I think a lot of it has to do just generationally. She doesn't, like she comes from a time where being gay or LGBTQ or being gay or lesbian was more like, okay, we're okay with that more than the generation before. But the transgender thing was totally new for, her. I mean, not totally new. Sorry. They've been around obviously for forever, but as a social issue is something that we know or accept. It was never on our radar, No, I'm not giving her excuse or anything, but that's like the closest. Like when
you're just looking at her perspective.
But that's the problem when you start having opinions and the opinions kind of go out of step with the rest of society, then it's a problem.
Well, I just love everybody, and I love for everyone to feel like they can be their authentic, best, successful self. And I agree that people become so famous that they feel like maybe their opinion is higher than the average normal person's opinion and feel like they can say whatever they want to say, and it's just unfortunate.
That's never a good thing when you think that. And I think John probably would have had that.
Well, what about you? What do you think is the most? I mean, I took yours. I stole it.
I agree.
Are you gonna have to come up with a new idea?
No, I think mine is the right one.
So we agree that you're a genius.
No. That John would have kind of worn out his welcome, and that Paul would have been seen as a little bit more of he would have been appreciated more for what he did to music than he is now.
I feel like Paul kind of like maintained and held the idea of the Beatles that we all want to remember. I just remember seeing him. It was like a surprise pop-up performance for a bunch of people in a pub, and I was tearing up. I'm like, this man is amazing. His songs are incredible, and he just makes you feel wonderful. And that's what we all want to remember the Beatles for. Okay, Koji, tell me your favorite or worst Beatles song and why.
I actually don't have a worst. My favorite Beatles song is "Hey Jude."
Oh, that's such a good one.
I love the story behind, for John's son.
Mm-hmm.
I just love how it's like 6 minutes, or what the original version is like 6 minutes, and I love that. I just like, that's the one song that I could listen to over and over and over. What about you? What's your favorite or worst Beatles song?
While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and the reason why is because it's one that people talk about less, and I heard a version of it in Kubo and the Two Strings that was just so beautiful, and it kind of shifted me over to listening to some of the more beautiful songs that the Beatles have written, and it's just one of those, I feel like I can feel like every moment and feeling in the song.
Do you have a worst?
No.
No?
Okay. It's no worst. Maybe there's one, isn't there about like being an egg and a walrus?
Yeah, I don't like that one.
Just really random. It's fun. I like the funness of it, but it's really random.
Yeah, some of the later songs, I know they're being experimental and stuff, but some of them it's just, I can't listen to.
Oh, I am the Eggman.
Yeah,
I am the walrus.
Yeah, some of those I'm just like,
I don't relate to Eggmans or walrus. All right. Thank you so much for listening. There are almost 3 million podcasts, and we're honored you've chosen ours to listen to. Please check out our website for our show notes and hear our past episodes, and be sure to follow us on socials. Be sure to tune in next month, where we'll be answering the question, what if Donald Trump had never been on The Apprentice?
Everything would be better.
It would be too good. Can I live in that multiverse?
Yeah, I want to live in that one too. That's a good idea. All right. Thank you so much. It was a great first episode. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Koji.
And thank you guys. Bye.
See you next time.